To understand the story of Finland, we have to begin long before there was a nation, a people, or even a landscape that looked anything like the one we recognize today. The history of this northern region starts in a world still locked under ice. During the last ice age, which reached its height roughly around 12,000 years ago, nearly all of what is now Finland lay beneath an enormous sheet of ice several kilometers thick. It was a frozen, uninhabitable world, shaped by slow geological forces rather than human hands. And yet, this harsh environment created the conditions for everything that followed. As the climate gradually warmed, the massive glacier began to melt and retreat northward. This process was slow, stretching over thousands of years, but its impact was profound. Land crushed under the weight of the ice slowly rose in a process known as post-glacial rebound. Lakes formed, coastlines shifted, and new ecosystems emerged. What would later become Finland appeared piece by piece, revealing tundra landscapes that eventually gave way to forests of birch, pine, and spruce. In a sense, Finland was still being born, and the land itself was the first actor in its long history. The arrival of humans came soon after the ice receded. Archaeological evidence suggests that the first people to enter the region arrived sometime after the end of the Ice Age, likely between 11,000 and 10,000 years ago. These early settlers were mobile hunter-gatherer groups who followed the movement of large animals such as reindeer and elk. They came from the south and the southeast, tracking herds across the exposed plains that connected different parts of northern Europe. Their tools, made from stone and bone, show links to both Eastern and Western traditions, hinting that Finland has always stood at the crossroads of cultures. These earliest communities lived in small bands, moving with the seasons and relying on the land's natural resources. They fished in newly formed lakes and rivers, hunted animals across forested landscapes, and gathered plants and berries during the warmer months. Although the archaeological record does not preserve their voices, their presence is visible through hearths, stone tools, and traces of early dwellings. Sites such as those found near the southern coast and around Lake Saimaa show that people were already adapting to Finland's unique environment thousands of years before recorded history. As time passed, these scattered groups developed more stable ways of living. Around the 6th millennium BCE, a culture known as the Suomusjärvi group became widespread. They left behind distinctive stone tools, including axes and scrapers designed for forest environments. Their lifestyle shows how people adjusted to the dense woodlands that were spreading across Finland at this time. The shift from open tundra to thick forest changed hunting patterns and required new skills. It encouraged fishing and trapping, and it pushed communities to refine their understanding of rivers, lakes, and seasonal cycles. During the 5th millennium BCE, another major cultural development appeared: the comb ceramic culture. Named for its pottery decorated with comb-like impressions, this group stretched across much of Finland and into neighboring regions. Their pottery is among the earliest evidence of ceramic production in this part of Europe. It signals not only improved technology, but also a growing sense of settled life, as ceramic vessels are harder to transport than stone or bone tools. Although people still moved seasonally, camps became more regular, and social networks expanded through trade across the Baltic. These networks connected Finland to a broader world. Amber, slate, and other materials found in Finnish archaeological sites show that long-distance exchange was already part of daily life thousands of years ago. Ideas flowed along with objects. Fishing techniques, tool designs, and pottery styles changed over time, indicating contact with communities in modern-day Russia, Estonia, and Scandinavia. Finland was never isolated. It was part of a northern web of cultures that shared resources and knowledge. Slowly, over many centuries, the ancestors of the modern Finns and the Sami people began to take shape as distinct groups. Linguistic research points to an early form of the Finno-Ugric languages, spreading into the region from the east. These languages, which today include Finnish, Estonian, Sami, and Hungarian, likely arrived in stages. The earliest layers may have come with small groups who settled in different parts of the region long before agriculture ever appeared. The Sami language, for instance, likely split from early Finnic forms thousands of years ago, and the Sami people gradually established themselves across northern Fennoscandia. This gradual separation of communities was influenced by climate, geography, and lifestyle. The Sami adopted a highly mobile way of life suited to the far north, specializing in reindeer hunting and later, herding. Meanwhile, the ancestors of the Finns settled more permanently in southern and central regions, relying on a mixture of hunting, fishing, and eventually small-scale agriculture. Although these groups shared some cultural roots, their environments shaped them differently, and over generations they became culturally and linguistically distinct. Another shift came during the Bronze Age, beginning roughly in the second millennium BCE. Bronze tools and weapons appeared in Finland, though the metal was rare and had to be imported from distant regions because Finland lacked local sources of copper and tin. This scarcity meant bronze items were prized possessions, often found in burial sites or ceremonial contexts. Their presence suggests growing social differentiation, as only certain individuals or families could access such valuable objects. The spread of bronze also hints at increasingly organized trade routes, further connecting Finland to Northern Europe. Throughout this period, Finland remained a land of small, scattered communities living within a vast natural landscape. Yet these communities were not static. By the early Iron Age, which began around the first millennium BCE, new technologies, tools, and cultural practices entered Finland. Iron was more abundant and more accessible than bronze, allowing local production rather than relying entirely on trade. With iron tools, agriculture became more practical, and forests could be cleared more efficiently. Settlements grew slightly larger and more stable, though still small compared to those in Central Europe. As Finland entered the Iron Age, the region's human story shifted from small, mobile groups to distinct communities shaped by trade, warfare, and growing cultural divisions. By this time, the land was fully settled, and the people living here were forging identities that would influence the political and social landscape for centuries. What emerged was a network of tribes, each adapting to their environment in different ways, each connected to much larger worlds through trade routes that stretched across Northern Europe and beyond. The beginning of the Iron Age in Finland is generally placed around the start of the first millennium BCE. Iron arrived slowly, filtering in through contacts with Baltic and Scandinavian communities rather than appearing through any local technological breakthrough. Unlike bronze, which depended entirely on imported materials, iron could be produced from bog ore found throughout Finland. This meant that iron tools and weapons gradually became more accessible. Communities that once relied on stone axes or bone-tipped spears now had stronger iron blades. This shift brought practical changes, such as improved hunting tools, sturdier agricultural implements, and more effective weaponry. The ability to produce iron within Finland contributed to the gradual growth of permanent settlements. Clearing forests for small-scale farming became easier, and agriculture slowly began to supplement older traditions of hunting and fishing. Fields were modest and scattered, usually managed by extended families who worked together. These early farms were influenced by the harsh northern climate, which limited what could be grown. But even so, the presence of cultivated crops marked a quiet transformation in daily life. Seasonal rhythms changed, and people began to organize around more stable homesteads. Distinct regional cultures emerged during this period. Archaeologists identify several tribal groups based on burial customs, artifacts, and settlement patterns. Among these groups were the Tavastians in the central regions, the Karelians in the east, and the Finns proper in the southwest. These were not unified political entities, but rather clusters of villages and extended families who shared similar lifestyles and traditions. Over time, however, the differences between them grew clearer, shaped by geography, local resources, and outside influences. The southwest, with easy access to the Baltic Sea, developed closer connections to Scandinavia. Trade flows brought metal goods, decorative jewelry, and weaponry from the west. Skirmishes and alliances between Scandinavian groups and Finnish coastal communities were not uncommon, and some burial sites reveal weapons typical of Swedish or other Scandinavian craftsmanship. These connections hint at a complex world of seafaring exchange in which prestige items circulated among elites who sought to display power and status. In the east, the Karelians interacted frequently with communities in what is now northwestern Russia. Their trade routes reached toward the lands of the early Slavic and Finno-Ugric peoples. Furs were a major commodity, prized across the northern world, and Karelian traders became known for their skill in navigating rivers and forest routes that linked the Baltic region to inland markets. These eastern ties shaped Karelian identity, contributing to distinctions that would later become politically significant. The Tavastians, living in the central inland regions, occupied a position between these two spheres. Their culture blended influences from both the east and west, and archaeological discoveries show strong local traditions in tools, pottery, and fortification building. The Tavastian heartland would later become an important strategic region as external powers began to take interest in Finland. But during the Iron Age, their society thrived as an inland community built around lakes, forests, and trade through overland routes. Trade was one of the most important forces shaping Iron Age Finland. Although the region was sparsely populated compared to Central Europe, it held valuable resources. Furs, including those of squirrel, marten, fox, and beaver, were among the most sought after. They could be exchanged for metals, ornaments, and goods that were difficult to produce locally. Finnish traders also exported tar, a vital product for waterproofing boats, and later seal oil from coastal hunters. These exchanges brought wealth and prestige to certain individuals or families. Burial sites from the Iron Age show clear evidence of social differentiation. Some graves contain finely crafted weapons, bronze ornaments, or imported jewelry, suggesting that local leaders used these goods to build influence. Other graves are much simpler, indicating unequal access to resources. This does not necessarily mean rigid social hierarchy, but it does reveal the beginnings of local chiefs or clan leaders who controlled trade networks and protected their communities. Iron Age Finland was not an isolated frontier, but a meeting point between several expanding cultural zones. To the west, Scandinavian societies were developing chiefdoms and maritime traditions. To the east, early forms of the Rus and various Finno-Ugric communities were shaping the riverine trade routes that would one day connect northern Europe to the Black Sea and the Byzantine Empire. Finland sat between these worlds, absorbing ideas and participating in exchanges that stretched much farther than the region's small settlements might suggest. Language also played a role in shaping the cultural landscape. The early Finnic languages had already taken root in southern and central Finland, while the Sami languages developed further north. These linguistic groups were not sharply divided by political borders, but they reflected deep migrations and cultural shifts that had taken place over thousands of years. During the Iron Age, these languages continued to evolve as communities interacted, traded, and sometimes competed with one another. While written records do not exist from this era in Finland, neighboring cultures left accounts that help historians understand its broader context. Scandinavian sagas and chronicles, written centuries later, occasionally mention Finnic peoples, often describing them in terms of their skills in hunting, magic, or distant trade. Although these descriptions are colored by myth and cultural bias, they show that Finnish tribes were recognized by their neighbors and that the region played a role in Northern Europe's larger story. As settlements became more established, fortifications began to appear. Hill forts, built on naturally elevated terrain, became centers of local defense and symbols of communal strength. They were usually simple constructions, made from stone walls reinforced with wooden palisades. These hill forts were not large enough to house entire populations, but they offered refuge during raids or periods of conflict. Their presence suggests increasing competition among tribes or pressure from outside groups seeking control over trade routes and resources. Though conflicts undoubtedly occurred, the Iron Age in Finland was not defined solely by warfare. It was a period of adaptation and change. People experimented with agriculture, developed new technologies, and created artistic expressions visible in pottery, jewelry, and decorative metalwork. One example of this craftsmanship includes intricate bronze spirals and animal motifs found in burial sites. These designs reveal a cultural world that was both spiritual and expressive, reflecting beliefs about ancestors, nature, and the afterlife. Religion in Iron Age. Finland remains partly mysterious, but archaeological evidence suggests a worldview deeply connected to the natural environment. Animals such as bears held important symbolic roles, and many communities practiced rituals tied to hunting and seasonal cycles. Sacred sites likely existed in forests, by lakes, or on hilltops, places where people sought guidance or offered thanks. These beliefs shaped daily life and strengthened communal bonds. As the Iron Age shifted into the medieval era, the lands that would one day form Finland found themselves facing new pressures that came not from trade or tribal rivalries, but from ambitious foreign powers seeking to extend their authority. By this time, the tribes of Finland had established distinct identities, regional networks, and patterns of life. Yet they were still politically fragmented, organized around local leaders rather than any central authority. This fragmentation, combined with Finland's strategic position along the Baltic Sea, made the region increasingly attractive to neighboring kingdoms that were expanding their influence. Among these powers, Sweden emerged as the dominant force, driven by both religious ambition and political calculation. The medieval period in Northern Europe was marked by the spread of Christianity, a movement that carried not only spiritual meaning, but also political weight. By the early Middle Ages, Sweden had already embraced Christianity and was transforming its institutions around the new faith. As the Swedish crown strengthened its internal rule, it also looked outward toward lands that remained outside Christian Europe. Finland, lying directly across the Baltic, was one of these frontier regions. To Swedish rulers, it represented both an opportunity and a challenge. In their view, controlling Finland offered a way to secure trade routes, limit the influence of rival powers, and expand the reach of the Church. This combination of motives led to a series of military and missionary campaigns, often referred to as the Swedish Crusades. Although later medieval and early modern chroniclers tended to frame these as religious expeditions, modern historians emphasize that they were deeply tied to geopolitical interests. The exact details of these campaigns are debated, but their effects are clear. They marked the beginning of sustained Swedish expansion into Finnish territory and opened the door to the gradual Christianization of the region. One of the most widely known episodes involves the figure of Bishop Henry, a missionary said to have traveled to Finland during a Swedish-led expedition. His story became foundational in Finnish Christian tradition. According to later accounts, Bishop Henry accompanied King Eric, remembered as Saint Eric in Swedish tradition, in a campaign to bring Christianity to the region. After the expedition, Henry reportedly stayed behind to continue missionary work, only to be killed by a local man named Lally. Although historians debate the accuracy of these details, the legend reflects a real shift taking place. Christian authorities were pushing into Finnish lands, and resistance was not uncommon. What made these campaigns significant was not any single event, but the broader change they represented. Swedish influence in southwestern Finland grew stronger as churches were built, clergy settled, and new forms of administration appeared. Missionary activity played a central role in the earliest stages, but the spread of Christian institutions soon became intertwined with political control. For local communities, this introduced new expectations regarding law, worship, and allegiance. Christianity brought with it the Latin alphabet, new rituals, and new forms of authority that connected Finland to the broader European world. The arrival of the church also altered the balance of power among local leaders. In many parts of medieval Europe, Christian institutions reinforced the authority of emerging states, and Finland was no exception. Aligning with the church could provide social prestige and access to connections beyond the local region. For some tribal leaders, cooperation with Swedish authorities offered material benefits, including protection and influence. For others, it posed a threat to established traditions. The process of conversion therefore varied widely, with some communities adopting Christian practices gradually and others showing resistance. Sweden's expansion into Finland was not only religious, but also military. Fortifications began to appear along key routes, signaling a more permanent presence. These early forts served administrative, defensive, and symbolic purposes. They marked Swedish authority in regions that had never before seen centralized rule. Among the most important early centers was Turku, which would later become the heart of ecclesiastical and political administration in Finland. From such bases, the Swedish crown could oversee taxation, legal matters, and the activities of local elites. The spread of Christianity also introduced new social structures. Parishes became centers of community life, and the church played a major role in education, record-keeping, and local governance. Priests, many of whom came from Sweden, taught Christian doctrine and helped integrate Finnish communities into the rituals and expectations of the wider medieval Christian world. Over time, these institutions reshaped daily life, influencing everything from marriage customs to burial practices. Another important consequence of Swedish expansion was the decline of other potential influences in the region. During this era, Novgorod, an important Rus principality, held significant power to the east. Novgorod's traders and missionaries interacted with eastern Finnish tribes, especially in Karelia, and the Orthodox Church began to make inroads into these areas. This created a cultural and religious divide that would deepen in later centuries. While southwestern and central Finland fell under Swedish political and religious influence, the East increasingly experienced interaction with Orthodox Christian traditions linked to Novgorod. This emerging divide was not only religious, but also political. The Baltic Sea region was becoming an arena of competition between Swedish, Danish, German, and Rus powers. For Sweden, securing Finland was important for preventing rivals from gaining a foothold on the northeastern Baltic shores. For local Finnish communities, this meant that outside powers were increasingly drawn into their world, sometimes offering alliances and sometimes imposing authority. As Swedish rule extended deeper into Finland, systems of law and taxation took root. These were adapted from Swedish models, but applied through local structures. Finnish peasants became part of a broader administrative framework that linked them to the crown. They owed military service and taxes, but they also gained access to legal protections under the Swedish system. This gradual integration helped stabilize Swedish control, though it also meant that traditional tribal structures weakened over time. Although these changes unfolded over generations, the cumulative effect was transformative. Finland's connection to Sweden grew stronger, and the region began to shift from a loosely organized set of tribes to a more structured part of a medieval kingdom. The Christianization of Finland, while incomplete in the early centuries, laid the foundation for new cultural developments. Even the use of written language began to spread through church activity, which would later play a crucial role in shaping Finnish identity. As Sweden strengthened its position in southwestern and central Finland, the region's eastern territories increasingly came into contact with another rising power, the Novgorod Republic. This powerful Rus state, centered around the city of Novgorod, controlled extensive networks of trade stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Ural Mountains. It maintained strong ties with Orthodox Christianity, and its influence reached deep into the lands inhabited by eastern Finnish tribes. The expansion of both Sweden and Novgorod turned Finland into a frontier zone, a place where cultures, religions, and political ambitions collided. This era marked a critical turning point in Finnish history. Instead of being shaped primarily by internal developments, Finland now stood between two ambitious powers seeking to consolidate control over the northern world. Each side understood the region's strategic value. Finland offered important trade routes through its forests and waterways, access to rich fur-producing territories, and a potential buffer zone against rival states. As a result, conflicts between Sweden and Novgorod became frequent, shaping the lives of the local populations. At the center of this struggle was Karelia, a broad region stretching from eastern Finland toward Lake Ladoga, an area inhabited by the Karelian people. The Karelians had long-standing trade ties with the east, and their routes connected them to the vast networks controlled by Novgorod. Because of this position, they played a crucial role in the early relations between the two powers. The Karelians were skilled traders and negotiators, and they capitalized on their ability to move goods such as furs, wax, and fish across long distances. Their control over these trade routes gave them leverage, but it also drew them into the geopolitical rivalries developing around them. As both Sweden and Novgorod expanded their religious and political influence, they sought alliances with local tribes, including the Karelians. These alliances were rarely stable. The Karelians at times aligned with Novgorod, drawn by existing trade connections and the spread of Orthodox Christianity. At other times, they cooperated with Sweden, particularly when threatened by rival tribes or when seeking military support. Their shifting loyalties reflected the complex realities of life in a frontier region, where survival often depended on balancing the interests of competing powers. Religion played a significant role in this era's tensions. Sweden, committed to Western Christianity, viewed the expansion of Orthodox influence as both a political and spiritual challenge. Novgorod saw the spread of Orthodox Christianity into eastern Finnish territories as part of its mission and authority. Churches, monasteries, and missionary outposts began to appear in areas influenced by Novgorod, while Swedish-backed Catholic institutions grew stronger in the West. The result was not simply a political divide, but a deepening cultural and religious frontier. Throughout the medieval period, these tensions frequently erupted into conflict. Raids, retaliatory attacks, and border disputes became part of life along Finland's eastern edges. In some years, Karelian groups launched raids into Swedish-held areas, sometimes with Novgorod's support. In other years, Swedish forces retaliated, striking at Karelian settlements or Novgorodian positions. These clashes were not always large-scale battles, but rather ongoing struggles for territory, resources, and influence. One of the earliest significant escalations occurred when Swedish forces pushed further eastward, attempting to secure regions beyond their original footholds. At the same time, Novgorod sought to protect its own interests by strengthening control over Karelia and the lands around Lake Ladoga. These actions increasingly brought the two powers into direct confrontation. Local communities caught between them often suffered the consequences, facing disrupted trade, destroyed settlements, and shifts in political authority. The need to stabilize this volatile frontier eventually led to diplomatic negotiations. The result was a landmark agreement, the Treaty of Nöteborg, concluded in the early 14th century. This treaty was significant because it represented the first formal attempt to draw a border across Finland. The treaty established a boundary separating Swedish-controlled territories from those under Novgorodian authority and, in doing so, effectively divided Karelia into western and eastern portions. The Treaty of Nöteborg did not create peace in a lasting sense, but it did acknowledge that both Sweden and Novgorod held legitimate claims in the region. The border recognized Swedish control over southwestern and central Finland, where Catholicism and Swedish administrative structures were already well established. Eastern Karelia, meanwhile, fell within Novgorod's sphere, aligning it more firmly with Orthodox traditions and Eastern cultural influences. While the treaty provided a framework for coexistence, it also formalized the division of Finnish-speaking populations into different political and religious worlds. This division would have a lasting impact on the region. Eastern Karelians continued to maintain close ties with Novgorod, and Orthodox Christianity became deeply embedded in their culture. Western Finns, under Swedish influence, moved steadily toward integration with the Western European world. Over time, these differing influences shaped identities, traditions, and loyalties in ways that would persist for centuries. Even today, cultural distinctions between eastern and western parts of the broader Finnic world can be traced back to this medieval division. Following the treaty, both Sweden and Novgorod worked to strengthen their presence in their respective territories. Sweden built new fortifications, improved administration, and encouraged the church to expand parishes and missions. Novgorod continued to foster trade and to support Orthodox communities through religious institutions. Local leaders were expected to align themselves with the authorities on their side of the new border, although in practice, loyalties remained complex, and borderlands were often zones of fluid identity. Despite the treaty, tensions did not entirely disappear. The border region remained a contested space, vulnerable to raids and shifting alliances. The location of the boundary itself was sometimes disputed, as medieval treaties lacked the precise mapping tools that modern states rely on. Still, the agreement represented an important milestone in the political shaping of Finland. It demonstrated that the region had become central to the strategies of neighboring powers, and it marked the beginning of Finland's long history as a borderland between East and West. Life for the ordinary people of Finland did not necessarily change overnight because of political treaties. Their daily routines continued to revolve around farming, hunting, fishing, and local trade. However, the presence of foreign powers meant that local communities had to navigate a complicated world of taxes, military obligations, and shifting authority. Some villages found themselves paying tribute to Swedish officials, while others were expected to offer support to Novgorod's representatives. These obligations could change depending on which side had the upper hand in a given region. The cultural divide that emerged during this era also influenced language and identity. While Swedish influence introduced new administrative terms and ecclesiastical vocabulary to the populations under its control, the East absorbed linguistic elements connected to Orthodox religious life and Eastern trade networks. Over generations, these distinctions contributed to the development of unique regional identities within the broader Finnic world. As the frontier between Sweden and Novgorod stabilized, Finland found itself increasingly drawn into the administrative, legal, and social structures of the Swedish realm. While earlier centuries had seen Swedish influence arrive through crusades and missionary efforts, the later medieval period marked a deeper, more organized integration. Finland was no longer simply a frontier territory contested by rival powers. It was becoming a functioning part of a kingdom whose institutions reached into local villages, towns, and parishes. One of the most important developments of this era was the establishment of Swedish law across the territories under Swedish control. Unlike the tribal customs that had previously shaped local governance, Swedish law provided a unified framework for settling disputes, organizing taxation, and defining obligations between the crown and its subjects. This legal system applied to both Swedish and Finnish populations alike, creating a shared basis for administration. Courts, overseen by local officials known as lagmen or lawmen, traveled through the region to hear cases and resolve conflicts. Their presence introduced new expectations about justice and authority, linking everyday life in Finland to decisions made far beyond the local community. Social order in medieval Finland was structured around the same estates that existed in the rest of Sweden. These estates included the nobility, the clergy, the burghers, and the peasants. Each estate had its own rights and responsibilities, contributing to the functioning of the kingdom. The nobility held land and provided military service. The clergy oversaw spiritual and educational matters. The burghers governed the towns and controlled commerce, and the peasants formed the backbone of agricultural life. Although Finland's population lived primarily in rural areas, these estates still shaped social roles and influenced local power dynamics. The Swedish-speaking nobility played a central role in administration. Many noble families received land grants in Finland, linking their fortunes to the region's development. Their estates became administrative centers where taxes were collected, disputes were mediated, and military obligations were organized. The arrival of these families did not erase existing Finnish communities, but it did create new layers of authority. Over time, Swedish nobles became influential landowners, and their cultural norms left a lasting imprint on Finnish society, particularly in language and governance. Towns also became more prominent during this period, even though they remained limited in number and size. Turku, already an important ecclesiastical center, grew into a political and economic hub. Its cathedral became the seat of the bishop, whose authority extended across western and central Finland. The town was home to craftsmen, merchants, clergy, and royal officials. Markets were held regularly, drawing people from surrounding areas to trade goods and participate in civic life. Other towns, such as Porvoo and Rauma, emerged as smaller but still meaningful centers of commerce and administration. Trade, already significant in earlier eras, now took on new forms as Finland became part of Sweden's broader economic network. Fishing, tar production, and agriculture continued to shape local livelihoods. But new opportunities emerged as Finland connected more closely with the Baltic world. Merchants transported grain, animal skins, fish, and timber to markets across the sea. In return, they brought metalwork, salt, fabric, and luxury goods into Finnish towns. Swedish rule provided protection for these trade networks, encouraging merchants to expand their activities. The church also played a fundamental role in shaping daily life and community identity. As Christian institutions grew stronger, they provided spiritual guidance, education, and administrative structure. Parishes became centers of community organization. Priests recorded births, marriages, and deaths, offering some of the earliest written accounts of local history. They also taught the basics of religious doctrine, ensuring that Christian beliefs became woven into everyday practices. Church festivals, rites, and obligations shaped the rhythm of the year, marking seasons with celebrations like Christmas, Easter, and midsummer feasts. For many Finnish peasants, life under Swedish rule involved new responsibilities, but also new protections. They were expected to pay taxes, serve in the militia when needed, and participate in community obligations such as maintaining roads or bridges. However, Swedish peasant law also granted rights that were uncommon in many other parts of Europe. Finnish peasants, like their Swedish counterparts, were largely free rather than serfs. They owned their land or held hereditary rights to it, giving them a degree of economic independence. This allowed rural communities to maintain stability and resilience, even as political authority flowed from Stockholm. Daily life in rural Finland continued to revolve around family farms. These farms were typically self-sufficient units, producing grain, vegetables, livestock, and other necessities. Families lived in wooden houses built to withstand long winters. Work varied with the seasons, sowing in spring, harvesting in late summer, preparing for winter in autumn, and repairing tools and equipment during the long, dark months. Despite the pressures of taxation and military service, many rural communities retained a strong sense of autonomy, rooted in local customs and family networks. Interactions between Swedish-speaking elites and Finnish-speaking peasants created a bilingual environment, especially in western and southern regions. Swedish became the language of administration, law, and the upper classes, while Finnish remained the everyday language of most of the population. This linguistic divide would shape Finnish society for centuries, influencing identity, politics, and cultural development. Still, the two groups were not completely isolated from each other. Trade, intermarriage, and local governance ensured regular interaction, and many Finnish families gradually adopted aspects of Swedish culture. The expansion of Swedish rule also prompted developments in military organization. Finland was strategically important as Sweden's eastern frontier, and the kingdom relied heavily on Finnish peasants for manpower. Local militias were organized to defend the region, and fortifications were improved to withstand potential threats. Although large-scale battles were rare during this early phase, the presence of Swedish authority and the need for defense created a culture of preparedness that would become crucial in future conflicts. One of the subtle but meaningful transformations of this era was the strengthening of written administration. As the church recorded events and officials documented taxes and property rights, Finland slowly became part of a documented world. Written charters defined town privileges, property boundaries, and legal rights. While literacy remained limited primarily to clergy and the small educated elite, the existence of written records helped unify diverse communities under a shared administrative system. As Finland settled more firmly into the structure of the Swedish kingdom, the next major transformation arrived not through conquest or frontier conflict, but through a sweeping religious and cultural shift that reshaped Northern Europe. This movement, the Protestant Reformation, altered the foundations of daily life, governance, and belief across the realm. For Finland, the Reformation did more than change religious doctrine. It introduced a written language, expanded literacy, and laid the groundwork for a shared cultural identity that would endure long after Swedish rule ended. The Reformation took root in Sweden during the reign of King Gustav Vasa in the early 16th century. His motivations blended genuine religious interest with political and economic goals. Breaking with the Roman Catholic Church allowed the crown to seize church property, reduce the influence of bishops loyal to Rome, and consolidate royal authority. These actions transformed the Swedish state and, by extension, all territories under its control, including Finland. When Sweden adopted Lutheranism as its official faith, Finland was drawn into the reform as an integral part of the kingdom. For Finnish communities, the transition to Lutheranism brought significant changes. The new faith stressed preaching, reading scripture, and personal understanding of religious teachings. This emphasis required a shift away from rituals conducted primarily in Latin towards services and teachings expressed in languages that ordinary people could understand. In Finland, this meant that the Finnish language, spoken widely among the population but previously absent from written religious life, began to move toward a written form. At the heart of this transformation stood Mikael Agricola, often called the father of written Finnish. Agricola was born in the southwestern region of Finland and educated within the Catholic Church before studying in Wittenberg, where he learned directly from leading reformers, including Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon. Influenced by their teachings, Agricola returned to Finland, determined to spread the principles of Lutheranism and to provide religious materials in a language that Finnish speakers could understand. His most influential contribution came through his work as a translator. Agricola set out to create a written form of Finnish that could serve as a foundation for religious instruction. This required him to make decisions about vocabulary, spelling, and grammar, drawing on regional dialects while striving for clarity and consistency. His efforts culminated in the Finnish translation of the New Testament, which he published in the mid-16th century. This monumental work represented the first major printed text in the Finnish language and marked the birth of Finnish literature. Agricola's translation did more than convey religious teachings. It established a linguistic standard that future writers could adopt and refine. Although Finnish existed in many dialects, Agricola's work created a foundation for a shared written language. His additional writings, including prayer books, liturgical texts, and catechisms, helped spread this standardized form across Finnish-speaking communities. Over time, this early literary effort became a cornerstone of Finnish cultural identity. The spread of Lutheranism also reshaped education. The Lutheran Church believed that every Christian should be able to understand Scripture and participate in religious life. As a result, literacy became an important goal, not just for clergy, but for ordinary people. Parishes were expected to teach basic reading, often through the catechism, which summarized core beliefs. This emphasis on reading dramatically increased literacy rates over the following centuries, laying the groundwork for Finland's later reputation as a highly educated society. In addition to language and literacy, the Reformation changed the structure of religious institutions. Monasteries, which had played a role in social care, education, and economic life, were dissolved across the Swedish realm. Their lands and wealth were transferred to the crown, altering local power dynamics. While Finland did not have as many monastic institutions as some regions in Central Europe, the closures nevertheless affected economic networks and religious traditions. Church buildings remained central to community life, but their governance shifted from Catholic orders to a Lutheran hierarchy aligned with the Swedish state. The new religious framework introduced changes to daily life as well. Lutheran teachings emphasized the importance of family, moral discipline, and personal piety. Sermons became the primary means of communicating religious ideas, and pastors were expected to guide their congregations in both spiritual and practical matters. Weddings, funerals, and baptisms continued as essential community events, but their meanings were reshaped through Lutheran doctrine. Even the church calendar changed, as some Catholic feast days were removed and new observances were introduced. While the Reformation unified Finland under a shared religious structure, it did not eliminate all tensions. Some communities were slow to abandon older practices, and remnants of pre-Christian beliefs continued to appear in local customs. The Finnish countryside held strong traditions tied to seasonal rhythms, nature spirits, and ancestral rituals. Although the church discouraged these practices, they often blended with Christian beliefs, creating a distinctive Finnish religious culture. Over time, Lutheranism absorbed and reshaped these older elements, contributing to a unique expression of faith rooted in both European doctrine and local tradition. The Reformation also influenced political life. As the church became more closely tied to the Swedish crown, Finland's integration into the kingdom deepened. Bishops, now Lutheran, played major roles in administration and education. Parishes served as centers of governance, recording population data, collecting taxes, and organizing local affairs. The church's administrative structure became a bridge between rural communities and the state, ensuring that royal policies reached even the most remote villages. One notable consequence of the Reformation was the expansion of printed materials. As printing presses spread across Europe, books became more accessible. Although Finland did not yet have its own printing houses, Swedish presses produced texts that circulated widely. Religious instruction manuals, hymnals, and educational materials reached Finnish parishes, reinforcing Lutheran teachings. Written communication slowly entered daily life, influencing how people learned, worshipped, and understood the world. Cultural life also evolved during this period. Music, particularly hymn singing, became a central element of Lutheran worship. Hymns allowed congregations to participate actively in services, creating a shared experience across different regions. Over time, Finnish translations of hymns enriched local musical traditions, combining European melodies with Finnish poetic structures. This musical culture would eventually become a powerful expression of national identity. The Reformation also opened new paths for social mobility. Education became more important, creating opportunities for talented individuals regardless of their background. Schools associated with cathedrals and towns grew in significance, training clergy, scribes, and administrators. Although access to higher education remained limited, the foundations laid during this era would eventually lead to the development of universities and broader educational reforms. As the changes brought by the Reformation settled into daily life, Finland entered a period shaped not by cultural transformation, but by war, state ambition, and the harsh pressures of emerging European power politics. The 17th and early 18th centuries were marked by Sweden's dramatic rise to the status of a major northern empire. A rise that carried profound consequences for Finland, which formed the kingdom's eastern half and often bore the brunt of its military campaigns. During these turbulent centuries, Finnish society faced heavy taxation, repeated conscription, and devastating invasions, culminating in a traumatic era remembered as the Great Wrath. Sweden's ascent began in the early 17th century, when Swedish monarchs launched a series of military campaigns across the Baltic region. Their goal was to secure control over important trade routes, strengthen national defenses, and assert influence over Northern Europe. These ambitions were not abstract to Finland. They translated into immediate demands on the population. Finnish men were recruited into the Swedish army in large numbers, forming regiments that fought far beyond their homeland. These soldiers marched through the battlefields of Central Europe during the conflicts often known collectively as the 30 Years' War, serving under commanders who sought to make Sweden a leading Protestant power. For Finland, this period of military expansion brought new forms of organization. The allotment system, introduced gradually across the Swedish realm, required peasants to provide soldiers, equipment, and support structures. Under this system, groups of farms collectively furnished one soldier and maintained his upkeep. While the system provided long-term stability for the army, it also placed a heavy burden on Finnish rural communities. Many farms were small and already stretched thin by short growing seasons and demanding winters. Supporting military obligations often meant sacrifices in labor, resources, and family stability. Despite these hardships, Finnish soldiers gained a reputation for discipline and resilience. The Finnish light cavalry, sometimes referred to as hakapelitat, became well known across Europe for their effectiveness in battle. Serving far from home, they became symbols of Finland's contribution to the broader ambitions of the Swedish crown. Yet for the families left behind, this reputation carried a difficult cost. Losses on distant battlefields meant missing husbands, sons, and fathers. Villages sometimes saw a generation of young men depleted by war. Meanwhile, Sweden's growing empire required not only soldiers, but also resources. Taxes increased to fund campaigns and to maintain new territories acquired through treaties and conflict. Finnish peasants, who formed the majority of the population, felt the strain as grain, livestock, and monetary taxes rose. In some regions, famine struck during years when harvests failed, or when excessive demands left families with too little to survive the harsh winters. These pressures made daily life increasingly unstable, and many communities struggled to meet both subsistence needs and the expectations of the state. The constant military demands also reshaped Finland's landscape. New fortifications were built in strategic locations to defend the empire's eastern frontier against Russia. Although Finland had long been a borderland, its role grew even more critical as Sweden and Russia competed for influence. Swedish authorities improved existing castles, built new strongholds, and strengthened their presence in key regions. These defensive structures were intended to secure the eastern frontier, but they also highlighted Finland's vulnerability. For centuries, the region had absorbed pressure from opposing powers, and tensions with Russia were far from resolved. The height of Sweden's great power period came during the reign of King Charles XII. His ambitious military campaigns pushed Sweden into prolonged conflict, particularly the Great Northern War, a struggle involving Russia, Poland, Denmark, and other powers. For Finland, the war brought suffering on an unprecedented scale. As Russian armies advanced into Finnish territory, villages and towns found themselves in the direct path of invasion. The period of occupation that followed is known in Finnish history as the Great Wrath, a term that reflects the devastation and trauma experienced by the population. During the Great Northern War, Finland became a battlefield in the struggle between Sweden and Russia. Russian forces penetrated deep into the region, capturing towns, burning farms, and disrupting all forms of local governance. Ordinary people bore the brunt of the conflict. Families fled their homes, fields were left untended, and communities faced shortages of food, shelter, and security. Reports from the period describe widespread destruction, forced labor, and the breakdown of social order. Many Finns sought refuge in the forests or fled westward to avoid the advancing armies. The occupation disrupted every aspect of life. Taxes could not be collected, parishes struggled to maintain records, and trade collapsed. The basic institutions that had grown stronger during earlier centuries, parishes, courts, and markets, were unable to function under the strain. Some regions experienced population decline due to famine, disease, or displacement. In other areas, families were torn apart as soldiers were conscripted or as civilians were forcibly relocated. The trauma of this era left a deep imprint on collective memory. Despite the hardships, Finnish communities demonstrated remarkable resilience. Villages rebuilt when armies moved on, families supported one another through shared labor, and local leaders attempted to maintain stability. The church, although strained, continued to provide spiritual and practical support. When the war finally drew to a close, Finnish society faced a long and difficult period of recovery. Rebuilding homes, restoring farms, and re-establishing local governance required tremendous effort. Yet the resilience of Finnish communities allowed them to begin this process even before peace was formally declared. The Great Northern War ended with the Treaty of Nöteborg, in which Sweden ceded significant territories to Russia. Although Finland remained part of Sweden, the loss marked the end of Sweden's era as a major European power. The kingdom emerged weakened, and the memory of the war's devastation shaped political and military priorities for generations. For Finland, the war confirmed both its strategic vulnerability and its importance within the Swedish realm. The eastern frontier had proven to be a critical battleground, and future policies would reflect this reality. The aftermath of the war also brought administrative changes. Recognizing the need for stronger defense, Swedish authorities reorganized military structures and invested in new fortifications. They also sought to improve taxation systems to stabilize state finances. For Finnish peasants, this meant that while the war had ended, economic burdens remained heavy. However, the state also recognized the need to support recovery. In some areas, temporary tax relief or rebuilding assistance helped communities regain stability. Culturally, the era left a lasting legacy. The suffering experienced during the Great Wrath entered oral tradition and later historical writing as a defining example of national endurance. Stories from this period, passed down through generations, emphasized resilience, loyalty, and the ability to survive extreme hardship. These themes would reappear in later periods of Finnish history, reinforcing a sense of shared identity rooted in perseverance. By the late 18th century, Finland had weathered centuries of frontier warfare, heavy taxation, and the sweeping political ambitions of the Swedish crown. The trauma of the Great Northern War and subsequent conflicts had exposed Sweden's declining military power, even as Finnish communities rebuilt their fields, towns, and livelihoods. Yet the world around them continued to change. Across Europe, old empires clashed, new alliances formed, and revolutions overturned established orders. Within this turbulent landscape, Finland's political fate would be reshaped not by internal rebellion, but by decisions made in distant capitals. The shift from Swedish rule to becoming a Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire marked one of the most significant turning points in Finnish history. The roots of this transformation lay in the growing rivalry between Sweden and Russia. Although the two powers had fought numerous wars over the preceding centuries, their confrontation in the Napoleonic era carried unprecedented consequences. By this time, Russia had grown stronger, while Sweden struggled to maintain its influence. Political tensions across Europe affected every corner of the continent, and Finland, positioned between the Swedish heartland and the expanding Russian Empire, became a strategic prize. The catalyst for the next dramatic shift was Napoleon Bonaparte's sweeping influence over European politics. As France expanded its dominance, nations were forced to choose between allegiance to Napoleon or defiance. Russia initially opposed France, but later entered into an uneasy alliance. Under pressure from Napoleon, Russia demanded that Sweden join the continental system, a French-led economic blockade targeting Britain. Sweden refused. This refusal gave Russia the justification it needed to pursue long-standing ambitions in the Baltic region. For Finland, these geopolitical tensions meant that its future would soon be determined by decisions made far beyond its borders. Russia viewed Finland as a vulnerable frontier whose control was essential for securing Saint Petersburg, the empire's capital. Swedish leaders, weakened by internal division and without strong European allies, struggled to defend their eastern territories. When Russia launched its invasion, Finland became the central battleground in a conflict that would shift its political destiny. The war that followed, known as the Finnish War, brought rapid and sweeping changes. Russian forces advanced into Finland with the aim of removing the region from Swedish control. Although Finnish soldiers fought bravely within the Swedish army, the kingdom lacked the resources and strategic position to repel the invasion. Towns and fortresses fell one by one, and communication between Swedish leadership and Finnish defenders grew increasingly strained. The war's outcome became clear long before peace negotiations began. During the conflict, a remarkable shift took place among Finnish leaders and elites. Recognizing Sweden's weakening position, some of them began to consider whether aligning with Russia might offer opportunities for greater autonomy. Russia, aware of these sentiments, adopted a strategic approach. Instead of treating Finland as conquered territory, Russian officials promised to respect local laws, customs, and institutions. This approach contrasted sharply with earlier occupations and made the prospect of Russian rule appear less threatening than it might otherwise have been. The decisive moment came with the Treaty of Frederikshamn. Under the terms of this agreement, Sweden ceded Finland to Russia, ending centuries of shared history between the two regions. The treaty did more than transfer territory. It created a new political entity, the Grand Duchy of Finland. Although Finland would be under the sovereignty of the Russian Emperor, it would retain significant autonomy, a separate legal system, and even the possibility of developing its own political institutions. This arrangement was unlike anything Finland had experienced under Swedish rule. Russian Emperor Alexander I played a central role in shaping the new arrangement. He understood that granting Finland autonomy could transform the region into a loyal and stable part of the empire. To accomplish this, he convened a meeting of the Finnish estates in the town of Porvoo. This gathering, known as the Diet of Porvoo, marked the birth of Finland's new political identity. During the meeting, Alexander I pledged to uphold Finland's laws and privileges. In return, the Finnish estates swore loyalty to the emperor. This mutual commitment created a unique relationship. Finland remained under imperial rule, but governed itself according to its own traditions. One of the immediate effects of this shift was the relocation of the Finnish administrative center. For centuries, Turku had served as Finland's primary cultural and political hub. Under Russian rule, however, the capital was moved to Helsinki. This decision had symbolic significance. Stockholm had long influenced Turku, and Russia wanted a capital oriented toward the empire rather than Sweden. Helsinki, still a modest town at the time, was rebuilt and expanded into a new administrative center. Its neoclassical architecture, designed by European architects hired by Russian authorities, transformed the town into a symbol of Finland's new political identity. Finland's autonomy under Russian rule brought significant changes that distinguished this period from the previous centuries under Sweden. Unlike the earlier era, during which Finland had been an integral but subordinate part of the Swedish kingdom, the Grand Duchy now had its own position within a larger empire. The existence of a separate legal system, Finnish currency, and local governing bodies allowed Finnish elites to play a greater role in shaping their country's future. Russian rule, far from erasing Finland's identity, provided space for it to develop and flourish. Economic life also began to change. Under Sweden, Finland had often been constrained by its limited resources and peripheral position. Under Russian rule, the Grand Duchy gained access to broader markets, improved transportation networks, and new investment opportunities. Trade expanded, especially in timber, tar, and agricultural products. The opening of export routes toward Russia and beyond allowed Finnish merchants to strengthen commercial ties previously unavailable under the Swedish system. Additionally, the new political environment encouraged cultural and intellectual growth. Although the Russian Empire was autocratic, it tolerated and even encouraged some degree of cultural development within Finland. Finnish clergy, scholars, and political leaders found themselves with greater influence than they had possessed under Stockholm's centralized control. The University of Turku, which had suffered during the war, was later relocated to Helsinki, becoming a key institution in educating future leaders and strengthening national consciousness. Despite the new opportunities, life under Russian rule was not without challenges. Many Finns felt uncertainty about their future, unsure how closely the empire would adhere to its promises of autonomy. Memories of earlier conflicts with Russia were not forgotten, and suspicion lingered, especially in regions historically affected by warfare. Yet the early decades of the Grand Duchy were marked by relative stability, and the Russian authorities generally respected Finland's institutions. This stability allowed space for literary movements, cultural initiatives, and political thought that would later blossom into a full national awakening. One of the most profound long-term consequences of Finland's new status was the emergence of a sense of political distinctiveness. Under Sweden, Finns had been part of a larger realm in which Swedish language and culture dominated the administrative sphere. Under Russia, Finnish leaders found themselves responsible for defining and defending their own institutions. This required them to articulate what made Finland unique. While the country remained loyal to the Russian emperor, its leaders increasingly viewed Finland as a separate political entity with its own identity, traditions, and interests. The creation of the Grand Duchy of Finland marked not only a political shift, but also the beginning of a profound cultural transformation. For the first time in its history, Finland possessed a clearly defined administrative structure separate from Sweden, yet distinct from the rest of the Russian Empire. This unique position offered opportunities that earlier generations could not have imagined. Within this new framework, Finland's educated elites, clergy, and emerging intelligentsia began to cultivate a sense of shared identity that went beyond regional ties. A national awakening was beginning, one shaped by language, literature, political reform, and a growing awareness of Finland as a distinct community within Europe. One of the earliest and most symbolic acts of Finland's new status was the decision to move the administrative capital to Helsinki. While Turku had long been Finland's cultural center, it remained deeply connected to Sweden. The Russian imperial authorities sought a capital that would face eastward, aligning more closely with the new political reality. Helsinki, still small compared to Turku, offered a fresh start. Under the guidance of architects and planners brought from abroad, the city began to take on a new identity. Neoclassical buildings rose along newly drafted streets, creating a capital that projected order, stability, and modernity. These architectural changes were more than aesthetic. They symbolized Finland's emerging political autonomy and cultural confidence. At the heart of Finland's new administrative system was the reaffirmation of Finnish law and local governance. Emperor Alexander I had promised to respect Finland's traditional legal structures, and this promise became a cornerstone of the Grand Duchy's identity. The Senate of Finland was established as the central governing body, composed mostly of Finnish officials rather than Russian administrators. Although it operated under the authority of the emperor, the Senate handled internal affairs, legal matters, and economic policy. This system strengthened the sense that Finland governed itself, even while remaining part of a larger empire. The strengthening of Finland's institutions created space for cultural development. One of the most important factors in this transformation was the increasing role of the Finnish language. For centuries, Swedish had dominated administration, education, and the upper classes. Finnish, though spoken by most of the population, had rarely appeared in official settings. But as national consciousness grew, scholars and writers began to elevate the Finnish language as a cultural foundation. This linguistic movement played a crucial role in shaping early Finnish nationalism. A key figure in this development was Elias Lönnrot, a physician and folklorist who traveled through rural Finland collecting oral poetry, songs, and legends. These traditions, preserved through generations of storytellers, reflected the deep roots of Finnish culture long before written literature had taken shape. Lönnrot saw in these tales a shared heritage that could unify the diverse regions of Finland. His most significant contribution was the compilation of the Kalevala, an epic poem constructed from the oral traditions he gathered. The Kalevala provided Finland with a national epic, placing Finnish culture on the same stage as the great mythic traditions of Europe. The publication of the Kalevala had profound cultural impact. It inspired artists, musicians, writers, and intellectuals to see Finnish culture as rich, ancient, and worthy of expression in literature and art. The epic also introduced audiences across Europe to Finland as a place with its own history and mythology. This growing cultural confidence helped fuel broader movements that emphasized Finnish language, history, and identity. Alongside cultural developments, political thought in Finland began to evolve. Johann Wilhelm Snellman, a philosopher, writer, and statesman, was one of the central figures in articulating the idea of a Finnish nation. Snellman argued that a nation must be built upon a shared language and collective consciousness. In his view, Finnish-speaking people needed a written language, education, and literature that reflected their own lives and traditions. His advocacy played a major role in pushing for reforms that would expand the role of Finnish in administration and schooling. These intellectual movements did not emerge in isolation. Across Europe, the 19th century was a period of rising nationalism. Peoples under large empires, from Central Europe to the Balkans, began to assert their cultural and political identities. Finland's national awakening formed part of this broader trend, yet its path was shaped by the unique circumstances of the Grand Duchy. Finland enjoyed a degree of autonomy that allowed national culture to take root without immediate confrontation with imperial authorities. This peaceful growth distinguished Finland's experience from more turbulent nationalist movements elsewhere. While cultural leaders helped shape national identity, economic and educational reforms strengthened Finnish society. The 19th century witnessed significant population growth, urban development, and improvements in agriculture and transportation. New roads and waterways connected regions that had once been isolated. Increased trade with Russia and other markets supported the growth of towns and industries. This economic integration fostered greater social mobility, creating new middle-class groups who contributed to cultural and political life. Education played a central role in Finland's transformation. Schools expanded in number and improved in quality, and the University of Helsinki, relocated from Turku after a devastating fire, became a hub of intellectual life. Students and professors engaged in debates about literature, history, philosophy, and national identity. These discussions helped shape a generation of leaders who viewed Finland as a distinct nation with its own heritage. Although Swedish remained the language of many academic institutions for several decades, pressure grew to recognize Finnish on equal footing. As the 19th century progressed, linguistic tensions sharpened. The so-called language struggle emerged as a central political issue. On one side stood those who believed that Swedish should remain the dominant language of governance and culture. Many of these individuals came from long-established Swedish-speaking elites. On the other side were Fennoman activists, who argued that Finnish must be elevated to reflect the identity of the majority population. This debate was not only about language, but about the future direction of Finnish society. Whether it would continue to align closely with Swedish-speaking traditions or embrace a broader Finnish identity grounded in the lives of ordinary people. Gradually, the Fennoman movement gained momentum. Newspapers and literary journals written in Finnish spread new ideas to wider audiences. Schools began to introduce Finnish language instruction. In time, the Finnish language earned official recognition alongside Swedish, transforming the landscape of public life. This linguistic shift helped unify the population across regional lines and gave voice to cultural traditions that had previously remained outside official circles. The national awakening also influenced political participation. As Finland grew more confident culturally, debates about governance and society became more common. Scholars, writers, and ordinary citizens discussed the relationship between Finland and the Russian Empire, the nature of Finnish autonomy, and the rights of different social groups. Although Finland remained loyal to the emperor during this period, the country's growing sense of identity meant that many Finns saw themselves not merely as subjects of an empire, but as members of a distinct nation with its own path. As the 19th century progressed, Finland's growing sense of cultural identity and its well-defined autonomy within the Russian Empire increasingly stood at odds with broader political changes taking place in Saint Petersburg. The early decades of the Grand Duchy had been marked by relative freedom, tolerance, and a flourishing cultural awakening. Yet empires seldom remain static. The later 19th century brought a shift in Russian policy that would test Finland's institutions, challenge its identity, and awaken a new level of political engagement among its people. This era, often described as the period of Russification, did not erase Finland's autonomy, but it strained it to a breaking point and prepared the ground for the independence struggles that would follow. The roots of these tensions lay in the shifting priorities of the Russian state. After earlier reforms and periods of relative liberalism, the Russian Empire turned toward centralization. Increasingly concerned about nationalist movements across Europe, the Russian leadership feared that autonomous regions might threaten the unity of the empire. In this climate, Finland's distinct legal system, currency, and administrative institutions were seen not as strengths, but as potential challenges to imperial authority. The idea that Finland operated under different rules than the rest of the empire became harder for officials in St. Petersburg to accept. The turning point came during the reigns of Emperor Alexander III and his successor, Emperor Nicholas II. Under their rule, Russian policy toward Finland shifted sharply. Instead of respecting Finland's autonomy as earlier rulers had done, these emperors sought to integrate the Grand Duchy more tightly into the empire. Their policies, which Finns later called Russification measures, aimed to reduce Finnish self-governance, strengthen Russian administrative oversight, and bring the Finnish legal system closer to that of Russia. One of the earliest signals of this new direction appeared when Russian officials began to override decisions made by the Finnish Senate, asserting imperial authority in areas traditionally governed within Finland. Russian language requirements were introduced for certain administrative functions, marking a symbolic encroachment on Finland's long-standing autonomy. In public life, Finnish officials increasingly found themselves pressured to align with Russian expectations, while Swedish and Finnish-speaking citizens alike saw their political space narrowing. The imposition of these new policies created anxiety and uncertainty. Many Finns feared that their hard-won cultural achievements and administrative institutions might be dismantled. The memory of earlier conflicts with Russia, though distant, added emotional weight to this fear. Yet instead of provoking violent resistance, these pressures sparked a remarkable surge of civic activism. Finnish society, educated elites, clergy, merchants, and even rural populations began to mobilize in defense of their rights. A defining moment in this period came with the appointment of General Nikolai Bobrikov as Governor-General of Finland. Bobrikov was tasked with implementing policies that would bring Finland more closely under Russian control. During his tenure, measures were introduced that sharply limited Finnish political freedoms. The Finnish army, historically separate from Russian forces, was to be integrated into the imperial military. The authority of the Finnish Diet was curtailed, and the power of the Governor-General was expanded. These actions were deeply unpopular and widely viewed as direct attacks on Finland's constitutional rights. In response, Finns turned to methods of resistance, rooted in their strong tradition of legal and civic action. Petitions circulated across the country, gathering signatures from citizens who wished to defend Finland's autonomy. One famous petition, often called the Great Petition, collected hundreds of thousands of signatures. A delegation traveled to St. Petersburg to present it to Emperor Nicholas II. The emperor refused to meet them, a symbolic gesture that deepened Finnish distrust and confirmed fears that the imperial government no longer respected Finland's constitutional status. Despite this setback, resistance continued to grow. Newspapers, though censored, found ways to advocate for Finnish rights. Writers and journalists published essays defending the rule of law and urging citizens to remain united. Secret political groups formed, representing both moderate constitutionalists and more radical activists. Among the population, there emerged a sense of shared purpose that transcended linguistic and regional divides. Swedish-speaking elites and Finnish-speaking leaders found common cause, united by the belief that Finland's identity and institutions must be preserved. The pressure of Russification also heightened internal political divisions. In the struggle to respond, two broad political factions emerged: the so-called Old Finns and the Young Finns. The Old Finns argued that accommodation and negotiation offered the best chance to preserve Finland's autonomy. They believed that resisting imperial policies too openly might provoke harsher retaliation. The Young Finns, on the other hand, supported more assertive opposition. They contended that defending Finland's legal rights required greater firmness and public resistance. These debates reflected different strategies rather than different values. Both sides wished to protect the autonomy they believed was critical to Finland's future. As the conflict deepened, tensions escalated in ways that surprised even those who had long followed the political situation. Acts of civil disobedience became more common, and underground publications circulated widely. In one of the most dramatic events of the period, Governor-General Bobrikov was assassinated by a Finnish nationalist named Eugen Schauman. Schauman acted alone, believing that extreme measures were necessary to defend Finnish constitutional rights. While the assassination shocked both Finland and Russia, it also revealed the depth of frustration and desperation among some segments of the population. Bobrikov's death did not immediately end Russification, but it signaled that the conflict had reached a critical point. Shortly afterward, events in Russia shifted the political landscape. The Russian Empire faced widespread unrest, economic hardship, and growing dissatisfaction across its vast territories. Pressure mounted on the imperial government, culminating in the upheaval of the Russian Revolution of the early 20th century. This revolution forced the emperor to grant reforms across the empire, including in Finland. One of the most consequential reforms for Finland was the introduction of a new parliamentary system. The Finnish Diet was replaced with a modern parliament elected by universal suffrage. This reform made Finland one of the first countries in the world to grant full voting rights to women, allowing them not only to vote, but to stand for election. The establishment of a democratic parliamentary system dramatically expanded political participation and demonstrated the strength of Finland's civic traditions. It also represented a major victory for those who had resisted Russification, proving that collective action could shape the future even under imperial pressure. These reforms, however, did not eliminate the underlying tensions between Finland and Russia. While Finland gained new political freedoms, Russia remained unstable. Revolutionary movements, economic challenges, and political turmoil continued to shake the empire. Finnish leaders began to consider the possibility that the Grand Duchy's future might not lie within the Russian state. Finland's emerging national consciousness, strengthened through decades of cultural development and resistance, now intersected with political opportunities created by the empire's weakening authority. As the 20th century opened, the tensions that had defined Finland's relationship with the Russian Empire reached a breaking point. Years of Russification had weakened trust in imperial rule, while political reforms had awakened a new sense of possibility among Finns. The broader world was entering an age of upheaval, and the Russian Empire itself was beginning to fracture under the weight of internal pressure. Finland, positioned within the empire yet possessing its own institutions and identity, stood at the edge of a profound transformation. What followed was a sequence of events that would bring Finland its independence, but only through hardship, division, and civil conflict. The early years of the 20th century were marked by widespread turmoil throughout the Russian Empire. Economic difficulties, military failures, and social unrest fueled demands for reform. In Finland, these pressures intersected with the ongoing struggle to defend autonomy. When the Russian Revolution erupted in the early years of the century, forcing the emperor to introduce reforms across the empire, Finland seized the opportunity to expand its own political rights. One of the most significant of these reforms was the establishment of a new parliamentary system. Finland became one of the first countries in the world to adopt universal suffrage. Women gained full voting rights alongside men, and they were also eligible to stand for office. This unprecedented step reflected the strength of Finland's civic traditions and the determination of its citizens to shape their own political future. The new parliament, elected by a broad base of the population, represented a more democratic and modern Finland than ever before. Yet the changes in Russia were shallow, and stability proved temporary. The empire entered a period of deepening crisis, exacerbated by costly military engagements and internal dissent. Finland, watching events unfold, experienced uncertainty, but also saw opportunities for greater independence. Many Finns believed that the empire's struggles might eventually allow the Grand Duchy to redefine its political status. The decisive turning point came when the Russian Empire experienced another wave of revolutionary upheaval. This revolution toppled the imperial government, ending centuries of Romanov rule. In Finland, the collapse of central authority created a power vacuum. Without the emperor's oversight, the legal basis for Finland's relationship with Russia came into question. Finnish leaders faced the urgent task of determining how to govern in the absence of imperial authority. Seizing this moment, the Finnish parliament asserted its right to supreme authority in internal matters. This declaration was not yet a statement of full independence, but it marked a crucial step towards sovereignty. Meanwhile, competing political movements within Finland pushed different visions for the future. Socialists argued for far-reaching reforms to address long-standing inequalities in land ownership, labor rights, and economic conditions. Conservatives sought stability and continuity, emphasizing the need to preserve order during a time of international uncertainty. These internal tensions intensified as Russia descended further into chaos. The revolutionary government in Petrograd struggled to maintain control, and the empire fragmented into multiple competing factions. Finland's leaders recognized that the Grand Duchy could no longer rely on Russia for governance or protection. In this environment, the case for independence grew stronger by the day. After extensive debate and considerable pressure from political groups across the spectrum, Finland declared itself an independent state. This act represented the culmination of decades of cultural awakening, political resistance, and civic mobilization. However, independence did not bring unity. The new state faced immediate challenges as deep social and economic divisions resurfaced with alarming force. Finland had long experienced inequality between landowners and landless workers, between rural laborers and emerging industrial populations, and between different political ideologies. These tensions, suppressed during the struggle against Russification, now erupted openly. The political climate was polarized. Conservative leaders sought to stabilize the new nation under parliamentary authority, while socialist groups believed that the moment offered a chance to reshape society more radically. The power vacuum left by the collapse of Russian authority further destabilized the situation. Without a unified security force, local militias formed across the country. Workers' militias and Red Guards emerged in towns and industrial centers, while conservative groups organized white militias in rural regions. Initially, these groups were created for protection, but their presence soon intensified political divisions. As the tension escalated, mistrust deepened between socialists and conservatives, and compromise grew increasingly unlikely. The crisis finally erupted into armed conflict, the Finnish Civil War. This war was one of the most painful chapters in Finland's history. The Red side, composed largely of workers, tenant farmers, and socialist activists, sought to implement sweeping social reforms and align Finland with broader revolutionary movements taking place across Europe. The white side, led by conservative and nationalist leaders, aimed to restore stability, protect private property, and maintain parliamentary governance. General Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, a former officer in the Russian Imperial Army, emerged as the white commander. The conflict divided families, communities, and regions. Southern Finland, with its industrial centers and larger working-class population, became the stronghold of the Reds. Northern and central Finland, more agrarian in nature, supported the whites. The war was marked by intense fighting, reprisals, and atrocities committed by both sides. Civilians suffered immensely as front lines shifted and battles engulfed towns and villages. Foreign powers played a limited but significant role. Germany, seeking to expand its influence in Northern Europe, supported the white forces with arms and military advisors. Soviet Russia, although weakened and chaotic, offered some assistance to the Reds but was unable to intervene substantially. These external actors added complexity to the conflict, but the war's core issues remained rooted in Finland's internal divisions. After months of fighting, the white forces gained the upper hand. Better organization, stronger supply lines, and German assistance contributed to their victory. The Reds were defeated, and the war came to an end. Yet the conclusion of the conflict did not immediately heal the wounds left behind. The aftermath of the Civil War was marked by imprisonment, executions, and widespread suffering among defeated Red supporters. The bitterness of this period created emotional and political scars that would shape Finnish society for decades. When the guns of the Finnish Civil War fell silent, Finland emerged as an independent nation burdened by grief, but determined to build a functioning republic. The conflict had split communities and families, and the emotional wounds were deep. But the new state faced an urgent task: securing stability in a world still reeling from global upheaval. Across Europe, newly formed or reborn nations struggled to find their footing, while radical ideologies gained traction amid economic uncertainty. Finland, too, entered the interwar era navigating fragile political structures, competing visions for the future, and the lingering shadows of recent violence. Yet despite these challenges, Finland would succeed, through trial and error, in strengthening democratic institutions and preserving constitutional order. One of the first priorities for the young republic was to establish a solid political framework. The constitution adopted in the early years of independence outlined a parliamentary system with a president who held significant but not absolute powers. This structure was designed to balance authority among different branches of government, reflecting Finland's desire to prevent the concentration of power that had contributed to turmoil in other nations. The new arrangement also sought to integrate groups from both sides of the Civil War, though reconciliation would take time. The early years of the Republic were marked by efforts to bring the country together. Leaders recognized that the Civil War had not been merely a political conflict, but also a social one rooted in inequality, land disputes, and economic hardship. Addressing these underlying issues was essential if Finland hoped to avoid further instability. As a result, land reforms gained prominence in national policy. Many rural laborers who had previously worked as tenant farmers or landless crofters sought security, and land redistribution became a way to address their grievances. Gradually, legislation allowed thousands of families to acquire their own small farms, reducing tensions in the countryside and fostering a sense of belonging within the new state. At the same time, Finland worked to build a democratic political culture. Multiple parties emerged, representing conservatives, liberals, farmers, socialists, and more radical groups. While disagreements were common and debates often heated, the political system provided a peaceful arena for competing visions. Crucially, the Social Democratic Party, whose supporters had been central to the Red side during the Civil War, was allowed to participate freely in elections. This commitment to political inclusion helped prevent the deepening of divisions that had torn the country apart just a few years earlier. However, the interwar years were far from peaceful. Economic conditions fluctuated, and global financial instability eventually reached Finland. The collapse of world markets affected agricultural prices and employment, pushing many families into hardship. Discontent grew, and some groups looked for answers in more extreme ideologies. Across Europe, authoritarian movements were gaining ground, and Finland was not immune to these trends. One of the most dramatic manifestations of this tension was the rise of the Lapua movement. Originating in rural areas of western Finland, the movement drew support from individuals who held fiercely anti-communist views and feared the resurgence of leftist influence. The group claimed to defend Finland from internal threats, but its methods soon became aggressive. Kidnappings of political opponents, public intimidation, and attempts to pressure the government became increasingly common. The movement's rhetoric echoed the broader European wave of extremist nationalism. For many Finns, the Lapua movement represented a dangerous step toward authoritarianism. The government faced a difficult challenge: how to curb the movement's influence without provoking further unrest. Tensions reached a breaking point when members of the Lapua movement attempted a coup by kidnapping political leaders and seeking to force radical changes in the government. This attempt, known as the Mensala Rebellion, ultimately failed thanks to firm action by the state and a refusal by many supporters to follow the movement into open rebellion. The government's decisive response to the rebellion demonstrated Finland's commitment to democracy. President Per Evan Svinhufvud delivered a crucial radio address urging citizens to reject extremist actions and uphold constitutional order. His words helped calm the situation, and the movement quickly dissolved. The episode reinforced the strength of legal institutions and underscored Finland's determination not to follow the authoritarian path taken by several European neighbors. While dealing with threats from the far right, Finland also confronted internal divisions within the socialist movement. After the Civil War, the Social Democratic Party had returned to legal politics, but more radical leftist factions operated underground or relied on support from Soviet Russia. These groups sought revolutionary change, mirroring movements across Europe. To address these tensions, the Finnish government banned extremist organizations on both the left and right, aiming to protect democratic processes from violent disruption. This balancing act, opposing radicalism while allowing broad political participation, became a hallmark of Finnish interwar governance. Another important development of this era was Finland's foreign policy, which had to navigate a complex and shifting international environment. With the Soviet Union situated directly across the eastern border, Finnish leaders sought ways to ensure national security without provoking conflict. Diplomatic relations were established with numerous countries, and Finland joined international organizations designed to support peace and cooperation. The country cultivated ties with Western democracies as well as with Scandinavian neighbors, aiming to balance local realities with broader strategic needs. One of the persistent concerns in Finnish foreign policy was the unresolved question of Karelia and other eastern territories lost during earlier conflicts. While some political groups advocated efforts to reclaim these lands, most leaders recognized that aggressive actions could endanger Finland's fragile independence. As a result, foreign policy emphasized caution, neutrality, and the need to maintain peaceful relations with the Soviet Union. This pragmatic approach helped Finland avoid many of the international crises that destabilized other nations during the same period. Despite political tensions, the interwar years also saw progress in social and cultural development. Education expanded, literacy increased, and new cultural institutions emerged. Finnish literature, music, and art flourished as the national awakening matured. The works of authors, composers, and artists gained recognition both at home and abroad, reflecting a growing confidence in Finnish cultural identity. These developments strengthened the sense of national unity that political challenges had tested. Urbanization accelerated as cities grew and industries expanded. Workers' associations, cultural organizations, and sports clubs contributed to a vibrant civil society. New newspapers and journals shaped public debate, while universities produced graduates who would play key roles in politics, business, and education. Although economic challenges persisted, Finland was gradually building a modern, connected society grounded in democratic values. As the 1930s drew to a close, Finland found itself facing a world rapidly sliding toward another devastating conflict. The fragile stability achieved during the interwar period stood in stark contrast to the rising tensions across Europe. Authoritarian regimes were gaining power, international alliances were shifting, and the borders of nations felt increasingly uncertain. Finland, with its long frontier touching the Soviet Union, understood acutely that peace could not be taken for granted. The next chapter in Finnish history would test the country's unity, endurance, and determination more than any previous era. It would also shape Finland's international identity for generations to come. Although Finland's leaders sought to maintain neutrality, the geopolitical situation left little room for comfort. The Soviet Union viewed the rise of Nazi Germany with apprehension and sought to strengthen its Western defenses. In this view, Finland occupied a strategically sensitive position. The Finnish border lay alarmingly close to Leningrad, one of the Soviet Union's key cities. Soviet leaders feared that an enemy might one day use Finnish territory as a staging ground for attack. As a result, they began to demand territorial concessions from Finland, arguing that security required adjustments to the border. Finnish leaders understood the significance of these demands, but were unwilling to surrender land essential to national identity and defense. Negotiations between the two countries followed, yet the gap remained wide. Finland sought to preserve its sovereignty. The Soviet Union insisted on strategic guarantees. Diplomacy stalled. Against the backdrop of rising global tension, the Soviet leadership chose a course of action that would plunge the region into war. Soviet forces launched an invasion of Finland, initiating a conflict that came to be known as the Winter War. For the Finnish people, the invasion struck with shocking speed, but not with complete surprise. Although Finland's military resources were limited compared to the vast strength of the Soviet Union, the country had prepared defensive plans and retained a sense of national unity forged during earlier struggles. The Finnish army, composed of citizen soldiers and reservists, mobilized quickly. They faced an opponent many times larger, equipped with immense reserves of manpower and machinery. The Winter War became a story of resilience, improvisation, and determination. The Soviet Union expected a swift victory, but Finnish resistance proved far stronger than anticipated. The harsh northern winter, with its deep snow, freezing temperatures, and limited daylight, favored defenders who knew the land intimately. Finnish soldiers, skilled in skiing, forest combat, and survival techniques, used mobility and knowledge of terrain to counter Soviet advances. Small, well-coordinated Finnish units harassed larger Soviet formations, striking supply lines, using camouflage effectively, and relying on swift movement through forests and frozen landscapes. This extraordinary defensive effort soon captured global attention. Newspapers around the world reported on the Finnish stand, often portraying it as a David versus Goliath struggle. Although Finland received sympathy and some material support from other nations, its forces largely fought alone. The Finnish leadership, including commanders such as Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, guided strategy with the goal of inflicting enough losses to force negotiations while preserving the army's ability to resist. Despite Finnish skill and determination, the Soviet Union's immense resources eventually turned the tide. After suffering heavy losses and reorganizing its command, the Soviet military launched renewed offensives. Finnish defenders fought desperately, but the sheer weight of Soviet numbers and artillery pushed them back. As winter began to recede, Finland faced the grim reality that continued fighting could lead to complete occupation. The Winter War ended with a peace agreement that required Finland to cede significant territories, particularly in Karelia. These losses were deeply painful. Entire communities were uprooted as residents of the ceded areas evacuated their homes, carrying only what they could transport. More than 1 out of every 10 Finns became displaced persons almost overnight. Yet despite territorial losses, Finland preserved its independence. This outcome, though costly, held enormous significance. In an era when many small nations fell to larger powers, Finland remained sovereign. The end of the Winter War did not bring lasting peace. Europe was still engulfed in conflict, and Finland found itself in a perilous position. The loss of territory weakened the country's defenses, and fears of renewed Soviet aggression persisted. At the same time, Germany sought to expand its influence in Northern Europe. Finland, desperate for security and military supplies, began to move cautiously toward cooperation with Germany. This was not an ideological alliance. It was a strategic calculation driven by the need to survive. Tensions with the Soviet Union remained unresolved. When Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union, Finland viewed the moment as an opportunity to regain lost territories and strengthen defensive positions. Thus began the conflict known in Finland as the Continuation War. Finnish forces advanced into the territories ceded after the Winter War, and, for a time, into additional areas beyond. This advance was driven both by military strategy and by the emotional desire to reclaim homes lost only a few years earlier. For much of the Continuation War, the front stabilized, and Finland entered a period of uneasy normality under wartime conditions. Society operated under rationing, military service, and restrictions, yet cultural and educational activities continued. The Finnish government maintained its independence and resisted German efforts to impose ideological control. Finland never became a puppet state and preserved democratic institutions even during wartime emergency. However, the longer the war continued, the more Finland's situation deteriorated. As the Soviet Union regained strength and began pushing back German forces on multiple fronts, the strategic picture shifted dramatically. Finnish leaders recognized that continued alignment with Germany would lead to disaster. Diplomatic contacts began in secret, as Finland searched for a way to leave the war without facing total occupation. Negotiations were difficult. The Soviet Union demanded substantial concessions, including territorial adjustments that went beyond the losses of the Winter War. Finland faced a painful decision: continue fighting in the hope of a favorable turn, or accept harsh terms to preserve sovereignty. Ultimately, the Finnish government chose survival. The Continuation War ended with another peace agreement requiring Finland to cede additional land and accept financial reparations. These terms were severe, but, once again, Finland avoided complete subjugation. The human cost of the two wars was immense. Tens of thousands of Finnish soldiers lost their lives. Entire communities were displaced, particularly in Karelia, where families were forced to relocate permanently. Many carried memories of lost homes and landscapes that would never be returned. Veterans returned to a country facing economic hardship, needing to rebuild both physically and emotionally. When the guns of the Continuation War fell silent, Finland entered one of the most demanding chapters in its history. The country had survived two devastating conflicts against a far larger neighbor, but survival came at a steep price. Territory was lost, homes were abandoned, families were uprooted, and the economy was strained nearly to breaking. Yet the Finland that emerged from wartime devastation was determined not only to rebuild, but to secure a lasting peace in a world increasingly divided between rival superpowers. The decades that followed required resilience, diplomacy, and a unique political balancing act that would later be described, sometimes critically, sometimes admiringly, as Finlandization. The immediate post-war years brought immense challenges. The borders defined by the new peace treaty carved away a large portion of eastern Finland, including the culturally significant region of Karelia. Hundreds of thousands of evacuees were forced to resettle in what remained of the country. These displaced families needed homes, land, schools, and employment. Their resettlement became a national project. Finland enacted land reforms to allocate farmland to Karelian evacuees, often purchasing or redistributing estates to ensure that families could rebuild their livelihoods. Although these reforms placed economic pressure on the state, they also helped integrate displaced communities and prevented social unrest. At the same time, Finland had to confront one of the heaviest financial burdens in its history: war reparations owed to the Soviet Union. Unlike many other defeated nations after major conflicts, Finland agreed to pay its reparations in manufactured goods rather than raw materials or cash. This requirement forced the country to industrialize rapidly. Factories that had once produced military equipment were repurposed to manufacture ships, locomotives, machinery, and other industrial products demanded by the Soviet Union. The scale of production was daunting, but Finland met its obligations ahead of schedule, a remarkable achievement that surprised many outside observers. This industrialization had unintended yet transformative consequences. It accelerated Finland's shift from a primarily agrarian economy to an industrial one. Workforces moved from farms to factories. Cities expanded, and new industries emerged. Although the reparations program had been imposed as a punitive measure, it ultimately helped modernize the Finnish economy and laid the foundation for decades of growth. Even as Finland focused on reconstruction, it faced a delicate challenge in foreign policy. The Soviet Union was now one of the most powerful countries in the world, and Finland shared a long and vulnerable border with it. The global political landscape had hardened into a Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, each leading competing ideological blocs. Finland was geographically and politically caught between these powers. The question was not merely how Finland could survive, but how it could preserve its sovereignty while avoiding conflict with its dominant neighbor. President Juho Kusti Paasikivi played a crucial role in shaping Finland's post-war foreign policy. Drawing on lessons from decades of conflict, he believed that maintaining peaceful relations with the Soviet Union was essential. This approach emphasized trust-building, diplomatic patience, and a realistic assessment of Finland's strategic position. Paasikivi negotiated agreements that acknowledged Soviet security concerns while preserving Finland's internal political system, economic model, and independence. His leadership helped stabilize relations during a period when mistrust and tension dominated global politics. Paasikivi's successor, Urho Kekkonen, would expand and refine this pragmatic approach. Over his long presidency, Kekkonen became synonymous with Finland's Cold War diplomacy. He cultivated a personal relationship with Soviet leaders, which helped maintain open communication and reduce misunderstandings. While critics argued that Finland sometimes made excessive concessions to avoid Soviet displeasure, supporters emphasized that these diplomatic efforts enabled Finland to remain democratic, sovereign, and economically connected to the West. This balancing act, appearing outwardly neutral while quietly securing its own interests, came to be labeled Finlandization. Despite the complicated nature of this diplomatic strategy, it worked. Finland preserved a political system rooted in parliamentary democracy, while many neighboring countries fell under direct Soviet control. Elections continued freely, multiple political parties participated openly, and civil liberties endured. Finland was not drawn into the Warsaw Pact or formally allied with any military bloc. Instead, it maintained strict neutrality, presenting itself as a peace-oriented nation committed to avoiding conflict. At the same time, Finland deepened its economic and cultural ties with Western Europe. Trade agreements, technological cooperation, and cultural exchange flourished. Finnish companies imported Western machinery and expertise, while also exporting industrial goods not only to the Soviet Union, but to markets across Europe. This dual economic orientation, eastward and westward, helped Finland diversify its economy and avoid overdependence on any single partner. Domestically, the post-war decades were transformative. The population experienced significant social mobility as education expanded and industrial jobs multiplied. The government invested in public services, including healthcare, pensions, and unemployment benefits. These foundations would later grow into Finland's modern welfare state. Urbanization accelerated, drawing people from rural regions into cities like Helsinki, Tampere, and Turku. Apartment blocks, schools, and hospitals rose to meet the needs of a growing and increasingly urban population. Cultural life also blossomed. New generations of artists, musicians, and writers contributed to a vibrant national culture. Finnish classical music gained international acclaim, while literary works explored both the trauma of war and the complexities of modern identity. Television and radio connected citizens across the country, creating a shared national conversation. Even sports played an important role in building unity, with athletes achieving remarkable success in international competitions, reinforcing pride during times of political uncertainty. Finnish society also grappled with the legacy of the wars. Veterans returned home carrying physical and emotional scars. The nation sought ways to honor their sacrifices while promoting reconciliation and unity. Monuments were built, memoirs published, and public commemorations held. At the same time, children who had grown up amid war entered a world striving for peace and stability. Their experiences helped shape a generation committed to maintaining independence without confrontation. Though Finland navigated the Cold War successfully, the period was not free of tension. The Soviet Union occasionally applied political pressure, criticizing Finnish decisions or attempting to influence domestic politics. Each of these moments tested Finland's diplomatic strategy. Leaders responded by reaffirming neutrality, emphasizing cooperation, and carefully managing public statements. This posture allowed Finland to maintain internal stability while signaling respect for Soviet concerns. By the time the Cold War entered its middle decades, Finland had already achieved something remarkable: a stable democracy, a rapidly modernizing economy, and a diplomatic balance that protected its sovereignty despite immense geopolitical pressures. Yet survival and stability were only the starting points for what would become one of the most transformative eras in Finnish history. The decades following the post-war reconstruction were marked by a profound societal shift, one that redefined everyday life, expanded opportunity, and brought Finland closer to the Nordic model that would later earn global admiration. Although Finland had long been influenced by Nordic neighbors such as Sweden and Norway, it was during this period that the country decisively embraced the principles of a comprehensive welfare state. This transformation was not a single policy or political choice, but a gradual series of reforms that reshaped healthcare, education, labor relations, and social security. These reforms emerged through cooperation between political parties, trade unions, employer organizations, and government officials. The underlying idea was simple yet ambitious: Every citizen should have access to essential services and support, regardless of background or economic standing. One of the most significant pillars of this emerging welfare model was the expansion of universal healthcare. Prior to the mid-20th century, access to healthcare varied widely between rural and urban areas. Many remote communities lacked trained medical professionals, and hospitals were concentrated in larger towns. Finland addressed these disparities through public investment, building clinics, training medical staff, and ensuring that healthcare services reached the entire population. The result was a dramatic improvement in public health, reduced infant mortality, and longer life expectancy. Over time, these gains contributed to a more productive and resilient society. Education reform played an equally transformative role. Finland had always valued literacy and learning, but the post-war decades brought widespread access to high-quality education. Schools were modernized, teacher training improved, and curricula updated to reflect contemporary needs. Importantly, education became increasingly equalized. Whether a child lived in a major city or a small rural town, the state sought to ensure that the quality of instruction remained consistent. These reforms would later form the foundation of Finland's globally recognized education system, though that reputation would develop fully in later decades. During this earlier period, the focus was on expanding opportunity, reducing barriers, and promoting social mobility. Labor relations also underwent profound transformation. Finland experienced rapid urbanization as people moved from rural villages to growing industrial centers. This transition brought both opportunity and friction. Workers sought better wages, safer conditions, and more stable employment. In response, labor unions grew stronger, while employers' associations organized to represent business interests. Rather than allowing these opposing forces to spiral into conflict, Finland developed a model of negotiation and compromise, often referred to as the Finnish labor market system. Collective bargaining became the norm, with unions and employers negotiating wages and working conditions at national or sector-wide levels. This system reduced the frequency of strikes and promoted wage stability, supporting economic growth. Urbanization itself reshaped daily life. Throughout the post-war decades, new housing projects emerged to accommodate expanding populations in cities such as Helsinki, Tampere, Turku, and Oulu. Modern apartment buildings replaced older wooden structures, and new suburbs developed along improved transportation routes. These changes altered family structures, work habits, and cultural life. City dwellers gained access to cinemas, libraries, cultural centers, and public transportation. Rural towns modernized as well, though at a different pace, leading to a broader conversation about regional equality. The expansion of social welfare programs did more than provide services. It also reinforced national unity. After the divisions of the Civil War era and the hardships of the world wars, social reforms helped bridge class divides. Access to education and healthcare reduced inequality, while pension systems and unemployment benefits offered security that earlier generations had lacked. This sense of shared responsibility for the well-being of all citizens became a core characteristic of Finnish society. As prosperity grew, cultural life flourished. Finnish literature, music, and the arts entered a dynamic phase of experimentation and innovation. Writers explored themes of identity, memory, and social change. Composers built on the legacy of earlier masters, producing works that gained international recognition. Visual artists embraced both traditional and modern forms, contributing to a rich cultural landscape. Public support for the arts increased, as the expanding welfare state saw cultural development as a vital component of national life. Meanwhile, Finland's relationship with nature remained central to its identity. Despite growing urbanization, Finns maintain deep ties to forests, lakes, and outdoor traditions. Summer cottages became widely popular, offering families an escape from city life. The concept of jokaisen oikeus, or every person's right, allowed everyone to walk in forests, pick berries, and enjoy nature responsibly. These traditions provided continuity amid rapid social transformation and reinforced an enduring connection to the land. Yet the era was not without challenges. Economic cycles brought periods of hardship, including recessions that tested the strength of the welfare system. Industrial restructuring led to job losses in some sectors, particularly forestry and mining. These changes required adaptation, retraining, and ongoing political negotiation. Social debates emerged as well. Questions about gender roles, family structures, and cultural expectations gained prominence, reflecting broader global movements. One notable area of change involved gender equality. Finnish women had long held voting rights and participated actively in political life. But the mid-20th century brought expanded opportunities in education and employment. As the welfare state developed, policies such as maternity benefits and child care support helped women enter the workforce in greater numbers. This shift contributed to Finland's reputation as a leader in gender equality, even though many challenges remained. Political life remained dynamic. Different parties alternated in government, yet core commitments to democracy, social welfare, and national unity stayed strong. Coalition governments became common, requiring parties to negotiate and compromise across ideological lines. This tradition of consensus building helped stabilize Finnish politics during a period when other European nations faced significant unrest. Foreign policy during this era continued to require delicate management. Finland maintained its neutral stance while strengthening economic ties with both Western Europe and the Soviet Union. Although the term Finlandization was sometimes used critically in Western political discourse, as shorthand for a small nation adjusting its policies to avoid offending a dominant neighbor, Finnish leaders viewed their strategy as pragmatic. They sought to preserve independence by demonstrating reliability in their diplomatic relationships, while quietly strengthening internal democratic institutions. This balancing act allowed Finland to participate in international organizations, host diplomatic discussions, and play a constructive role in global affairs. When Helsinki later became the site of major international negotiations, it was a testament to the credibility Finland had built through decades of careful diplomacy. The roots of that reputation lay partly in the post-war era's commitment to neutrality and peaceful cooperation. As Finland advanced through the latter half of the 20th century, the nation entered a period of rapid transformation defined by economic restructuring, technological innovation, and growing integration with global markets. The welfare state had laid strong foundations for equality and social stability. Yet the world around Finland was changing quickly. Traditional industries that had sustained the economy for generations began to face new pressures, while emerging technologies offered opportunities that could reshape the nation's future. The challenge for Finland was to navigate these shifts without sacrificing the values and institutions that had become central to its identity. For centuries, Finland's economy had relied heavily on natural resources. Forests were the backbone of national industry, supporting paper mills, sawmills, and related manufacturing. Timber and paper products formed a substantial portion of Finnish exports, and generations of families built their livelihoods around these sectors. While forestry remained important, the global economy was becoming more competitive. Other countries modernized their industries, new materials emerged, and demand fluctuated unpredictably. Finland recognized that depending too heavily on a single set of industries left the economy vulnerable to global shifts. This vulnerability became painfully clear during the economic downturns that struck Finland in the latter decades of the 20th century. The country experienced periods of recession that challenged its economic resilience. Demand for paper and timber products fell sharply in international markets, and rising production costs made it difficult for some traditional industries to compete. Unemployment rose, businesses struggled, and public finances came under strain. These crises forced Finland to confront a difficult truth. The economy needed deeper diversification to survive in an increasingly interconnected world. In response, Finland committed itself to innovation and technological development. Policymakers, educators, and industry leaders recognized that a highly educated population could drive new sectors of growth. Investment in research and development increased. Universities expanded engineering and technology programs, and the government encouraged collaboration between academic institutions and private companies. These efforts reflected a long-term vision, transforming Finland into a knowledge-based economy capable of thriving in global markets. Out of this fertile environment emerged one of the most important stories in Finland's modern history: the rise of Nokia. Although Nokia had origins in 19th century Finland as a company involved in rubber, cables, and forestry, it underwent a dramatic transformation in the late 20th century. The company shifted toward electronics and telecommunications, eventually becoming a global leader in mobile technology. Nokia's success was not simply the story of a single company, but a reflection of broader changes in Finnish society. A commitment to innovation, a strong education system, and a willingness to embrace new directions. The mobile phone revolution, driven in part by Nokia's technological breakthroughs, placed Finland at the forefront of global telecommunications. Finnish engineers developed devices and networks that shaped how millions of people around the world communicated. Nokia phones became symbols of reliability, simplicity, and modern design. As the company expanded internationally, it helped transform Finland's economic landscape. New jobs, new technologies, and new industries emerged around Nokia's success. Entire communities benefited from the company's global reach, and Finland's reputation as a technological powerhouse grew. Yet Nokia's rapid ascent should not be viewed in isolation. It was supported by a broader ecosystem of innovation. Finnish universities produced highly skilled graduates. Research institutes contributed to technological development. Startups and partner companies formed networks that strengthened the industry as a whole. This collaborative environment reflected Finland's long-standing cultural emphasis on equality and cooperation, now expressed in a new context of global high-technology markets. Despite impressive economic growth fueled by technology, Finland faced new forms of vulnerability. Globalization brought opportunities, but it also intensified competition. Economic downturns could now originate anywhere in the world and quickly affect Finnish companies. When Nokia eventually faced challenges in the global smartphone market, the impact on Finland was significant. Yet even this setback became part of a larger narrative of adaptability. Finland responded by continuing to diversify its economy, investing in new technologies such as information services, gaming, clean energy, and biotechnology. Another major force shaping Finland during this period was the country's deeper integration with international institutions and markets. As global trade expanded, Finland recognized the advantages of participating more fully in European and global economic systems. International cooperation allowed Finnish companies to reach new markets and benefit from shared standards and regulations. It also exposed Finland to economic trends that demanded constant innovation and competitiveness. While economic and technological changes transformed industries and workplaces, they also reshaped everyday life. Finnish homes adopted new technologies rapidly, from household electronics to personal computers and mobile devices. Communication patterns shifted, with email and mobile messaging connecting people across long distances. These changes influence social life, education, and business practices, contributing to a culture that embraced digital tools earlier than many other countries. The workforce also evolved. As industries modernized, many traditional manual jobs declined, while new opportunities emerged in engineering, design, software development, and services. Lifelong learning became a necessity, and Finland invested in adult education and job retraining programs. The idea that education should not end in youth, but continue throughout life, became widely accepted. This approach helped many workers adapt to shifting economic realities and supported Finland's transition into a knowledge-based society. Cultural attitudes toward work and innovation also shifted during this transformation. Finland developed a reputation for combining creativity with discipline. Companies valued collaboration and problem-solving over rigid hierarchies, reflecting broader social ideals of equality and trust. Workplaces emphasized cooperation, transparency, and continuous improvement. These cultural traits supported Finland's success in high-tech fields and strengthened its international competitiveness. Urban life expanded during this period as cities became hubs of innovation, education, and cultural activity. Helsinki emerged as a center for design, technology, and global business, while other cities such as Tampere, Oulu, and Turku developed their own specialized industries and research communities. Urban growth brought new forms of cultural expression, including music, theater, and film. At the same time, Finland remained committed to preserving its connection to nature. Even as cities expanded, forests, lakes, and hiking trails remained easily accessible, sustaining a balance between modern life and natural heritage. The transformation of Finland's economy was not without social tensions. Economic restructuring led to unemployment in some sectors, and rural regions sometimes struggled to keep pace with urban innovation hubs. Policymakers worked to address regional disparities through infrastructure investment, education programs, and incentives for business development. While challenges persisted, Finland's strong social safety net helped protect communities during difficult transitions. As Finland approached the end of the 20th century and stepped into the 21st, the country entered yet another phase of transformation, one defined by deeper European integration, evolving security concerns, and a rapidly changing society. The economic and technological developments of earlier decades had prepared Finland to take an active role in global affairs, and the collapse of the Soviet Union opened doors that had previously been closed. Finland was no longer confined by the geopolitical constraints of the Cold War. Instead, it had the opportunity to choose its alliances, shape its foreign policy independently, and engage with an increasingly interconnected world. The end of the Cold War fundamentally altered Finland's strategic landscape. For decades, Finland had navigated a careful path between East and West, maintaining neutrality while avoiding actions that could threaten relations with the Soviet Union. With the Soviet Union disintegrating, Finland faced a transformed Europe. New nations emerged, old alliances shifted, and the European community expanded its influence. The question facing Finland was not simply how to adapt to these changes, but how to redefine its identity in a world where the old rules no longer applied. One of the most significant decisions of this era was Finland's decision to join the European Union. Membership in the EU represented a major shift in Finnish foreign and economic policy. The process required public debate, political negotiation, and a national referendum. Supporters argued that EU membership would strengthen Finland's economy, expand trade, and anchor the country firmly within the democratic institutions of Western Europe. Critics feared the loss of national autonomy and expressed concern about how integration might affect agriculture, labor markets, and traditional industries. After extensive national discussion, Finland joined the European Union. This decision marked a turning point in the country's international orientation. As a member state, Finland gained access to larger markets, participated in shaping European legislation, and strengthened its ties with neighboring countries. The adoption of the euro further integrated Finland into the European economic system, aligning its financial policies with those of other member states. These steps underscored Finland's new position as a committed participant in European cooperation. This new orientation influenced nearly every aspect of Finnish society. Trade expanded, foreign investment increased, and Finnish companies gained new opportunities across Europe. Regulations governing commerce, agriculture, environmental protection, and transportation were harmonized with EU standards. While some sectors faced adjustment pressures, others benefited greatly from access to wider markets and shared research initiatives. Finland also became an active voice in European discussions on sustainability, education, and technological innovation, fields in which it had already developed strong expertise. Beyond economics, EU membership reshaped Finland's foreign policy. Instead of maintaining a carefully neutral stance shaped by Cold War realities, Finland now engaged more openly in European initiatives on security, humanitarian issues, and global cooperation. Although Finland did not join NATO during this period, it participated in NATO's Partnership for Peace program, engaging in joint exercises and contributing to peacekeeping missions. These steps reflected Finland's evolving understanding of security in a world no longer dominated by the bipolar structure of East versus West. Domestic political life mirrored these broader changes. New parties emerged, and existing parties adjusted their platforms to address globalization, environmental issues, immigration, and societal modernization. Public debate increasingly reflected concerns shared across Europe: economic competitiveness, demographic change, and the challenges of maintaining welfare systems in aging societies. The political spectrum broadened, giving rise to discussions about identity, multiculturalism, and the role of Finland in a globalizing world. Socially, Finland experienced shifts that redefined everyday life. Immigration increased as workers, students, and refugees arrived from different regions. Previously a largely homogeneous society, Finland began to confront questions of cultural integration, diversity, and the meaning of national identity. Public institutions worked to support integration through language programs, education, and social services, while public debates explored how Finnish society could adapt to new cultural dynamics. These discussions were sometimes difficult, but they reflected a nation increasingly engaged with global realities. Education continued to play a central role in Finland's national identity. Earlier reforms matured into a highly effective school system that prioritized equal opportunity, teacher professionalism, and student well-being. International studies soon recognized Finland as a global leader in education performance. This recognition was not only a point of pride, but also a source of national reflection. Why was the system so successful, and how could it continue to evolve in a changing world? Finnish educators emphasized that their system's strength lay in trust, autonomy, and a deep cultural regard for learning rather than competition. The economy also continued to evolve. The decline of Nokia's dominance in mobile technology created challenges, but it also spurred innovation in new sectors. Finnish companies diversified into gaming, renewable energy, software development, design, and biotechnology. The global success of companies in these fields, along with the rapid rise of the Finnish gaming industry, demonstrated Finland's ability to adapt when previous economic anchors weakened. Simultaneously, environmental awareness became a defining aspect of Finnish society. With its vast forests, thousands of lakes, and delicate northern ecosystems, Finland took an active role in global environmental initiatives. Policies promoting sustainability, conservation, and clean energy gained broad support. Finland invested in renewable energy technologies, sustainable forestry practices, and urban planning that aimed to reduce carbon emissions. These commitments reflected both practical concerns and cultural values deeply rooted in the Finnish relationship with nature. Culturally, Finland embraced greater openness. Music, literature, film, and design flourished in an environment that encouraged experimentation and international collaboration. Finnish musicians gained global audiences, authors received international awards, filmmakers found new platforms for their work. Helsinki and other Finnish cities developed reputations as centers of creativity, combining modern innovation with traditional aesthetics. Events celebrating art, design, and culture brought together domestic and international audiences, strengthening Finland's place in global cultural networks. As Finland became more globalized, debates about national identity intensified. Many Finns asked, "What does it mean to be Finnish in a world without the old Cold War boundaries? How should the country balance its cultural heritage with new influences? What responsibilities did Finland have as a member of the European Union? And how could it protect its distinctive values while contributing to broader European goals?" Part of the answer lay in Finland's enduring principles of democracy, equality, and social cohesion. These values helped guide the nation through debates about immigration, minority rights, and social integration. They also supported efforts to improve the standing of Sami communities in northern Finland, who continued to advocate for cultural rights, land use protections, and political representation. Efforts to support Sami language education and strengthen cultural institutions gained momentum as awareness of indigenous issues increased globally. As Finland stepped fully into the 21st century, the country faced a world in rapid motion. Globalization accelerated. Technology advanced at an unprecedented pace, and geopolitical tensions shifted unpredictably. Yet Finland entered this era with considerable strengths. A highly educated population, a stable political system, a reputation for innovation, and an enduring commitment to equality and social welfare. The task ahead was not merely to preserve these achievements, but to adapt them to a world where traditional assumptions no longer held steady. The 21st century would challenge Finland to reimagine its role, confront emerging pressures, and build resilience in the face of constant transformation. One of the earliest forces reshaping Finland in this new era was digitalization. Although Finland had embraced technology during the previous century, the digital revolution ushered in new possibilities and new uncertainties. High-speed internet, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and mobile platforms changed how Finns worked, communicated, and learned. Finland's early investments in education and technological infrastructure positioned the country as a pioneer in adopting digital solutions. Schools integrated digital tools into everyday learning. Public services moved online. Businesses relied increasingly on data-driven strategies. This digital transition also generated important debates. Citizens and policymakers discussed privacy, cybersecurity, and the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. With increasing reliance on digital communication came new forms of vulnerability, including cyber attacks and misinformation campaigns. Finland responded by strengthening digital literacy, enhancing cybersecurity readiness, and promoting transparency in governance. These measures reflected a broader cultural commitment to trust and openness, values essential for navigating digital society without sacrificing democratic principles. Alongside technological change, environmental concerns became a defining issue of the century. Finland, with its vast forests, thousands of lakes, and sensitive northern ecosystems, had long recognized the importance of sustainable resource management. Yet climate change introduced new challenges, from unpredictable weather patterns to threats to biodiversity and traditional livelihoods. Melting Arctic ice affected indigenous Sami reindeer herding practices, Forest health faced new pressures, and shifting temperatures altered fishing and agriculture. In response, Finland committed itself to ambitious environmental policies. Successive governments invested in renewable energy, promoting wind power, bioenergy, and emerging green technologies. Urban planning prioritized sustainability, with cities expanding public transportation networks, improving energy efficiency in buildings, and supporting innovations such as electric mobility. These efforts reflected not only global commitments, but also a deeply rooted cultural respect for nature. For many Finns, protecting the environment was not simply a political choice, but a continuation of traditions that valued the land as a source of identity, sustenance, and well-being. Demographic changes also shaped Finland's 21st century landscape. Like many European countries, Finland faced the challenges of an aging population. Longer life expectancy and lower birth rates created pressure on social services, healthcare, and pension systems. Policymakers introduced reforms to encourage workforce participation, support families, and integrate immigrants into society. Immigration, once minimal, grew in importance as Finland sought to meet labor needs and diversify its economy. These demographic shifts prompted national conversations about identity, social cohesion, and the meaning of belonging in a modern, multicultural Finland. Finland's indigenous Sami population also gained greater attention during this time. Long marginalized, the Sami advocated for stronger cultural rights, land protections, and political representation. Finland increased support for Sami language education, strengthened cultural institutions, and engaged in discussions about land use across the northern regions. Although challenges remained, the increased visibility of Sami issues reflected a national commitment to address historical inequalities and honor indigenous heritage. On the international stage, Finland continued to hold to principles of diplomacy, cooperation, and peacebuilding. The country participated in United Nations missions, contributed to development programs, and supported global human rights initiatives. Finland's identity as a neutral mediator, nurtured during the Cold War, evolved into a broader international role focused on dialogue, stability, and constructive engagement. Yet global security concerns grew more complex. Cyber threats, hybrid warfare, and increased tensions between major powers made traditional notions of neutrality more difficult. Finland strengthened its national defense by modernizing its military forces, investing in new technologies, and deepening cooperation with European and Nordic partners. Discussions about security became more urgent as geopolitical conditions fluctuated. The long border shared with Russia remained a central consideration, shaping Finland's strategic planning and public discourse. Domestic politics also evolved. New political movements emerged, reflecting changing social priorities. Environmental parties gained influence, advocating strong climate action. Populist groups voiced concerns about immigration, globalization, and cultural change. The political landscape became more diverse, requiring coalition building and compromise. Yet through all shifts, Finland maintained a robust democratic framework and public trust in institutions, supported by transparency, accountability, and civic engagement. Economically, Finland faced both opportunity and challenge. The decline of Nokia's dominance in mobile phones required Finland to redefine its technological strategy. Yet instead of stagnation, the nation embraced reinvention. New industries flourished, including information technology services, gaming, clean energy, and design. Companies such as those in the Finnish gaming industry gained global recognition, demonstrating Finland's continued strength in innovation. Startups found support through educational institutions, government programs, and a culture that valued experimentation and problem-solving. Finland's welfare state also adapted to modern conditions. Policymakers updated social protections to reflect new family structures, employment patterns, and technological realities. Emphasis shifted toward flexibility, lifelong learning, and investments in early childhood education. Finland's education system continued to evolve, balancing tradition with digital tools, individual creativity, and confidence building. Educators emphasized that learning should not simply produce skilled workers, but should support curious, resilient, and socially aware citizens. Cultural life in Finland during the 21st century demonstrated remarkable vibrancy. Finnish musicians reached global audiences, filmmakers gained international awards, and authors explored themes ranging from identity and memory to climate change and migration. Design remained a hallmark of Finnish creativity, with architects and designers continuing the legacy of modernist masters while embracing contemporary sustainable practices. Festivals, museums, and cultural centers celebrated both traditional arts and avant-garde expression, reinforcing Finland's place in global cultural networks. As Finland navigated these many transformations, public debates about national identity continued to evolve. Finns asked, "What does it mean to be Finnish in a globalized, digital, multicultural society? How can Finland preserve its values, equality, education, trust, and community, while adapting to new realities? How can tradition and innovation coexist in a rapidly changing world?" These questions reflected a healthy introspection, rooted in the belief that identity is not fixed, but continually shaped through collective experience. Through resilience, adaptability, and a willingness to evolve, Finland entered the 21st century as a nation confident in its strengths, yet aware of its challenges. It faced global pressures not with isolation, but with thoughtful engagement, not with rigid certainty, but with openness to change. From environmental leadership to digital innovation, from cultural expression to diplomatic participation, Finland continued to build a future grounded in cooperation and shared responsibility. The story of Finland, from its Ice Age landscapes and early tribes to its modern high-tech society, illustrates a nation shaped by endurance, creativity, and the ability to adapt. As Finland advances further into the 21st century, it remains guided by the same principles that supported its survival through wars, political struggles, and global shifts. A belief in education, equality, community, and the capacity to chart its own course in a changing world.